The Maya by Dr. Michael D. Coe. Chapter 6, The Terminal Classic. Maya's civilization in the central area reached its full glory in the early 8th century, but it must have contained the seeds of its own destruction, for in the century and a half that followed, all of its magnificent cities had fallen into decline and ultimately suffered from abandonment. This was surely one of the most profound social and demographic catastrophes of all human history. Yet, ironically, during the terrible era that saw the classic collapse in the southern lowlands, the Maya exerted an altogether unprecedented influence over the Gulf Coast and even the central highlands of Mexico. And it is clear that there was no similar decline in the northern area. Quite the contrary, in the Puuc region and at Chichen Itza, cities achieved a remarkable florescence, including some of the finest architecture ever seen in the pre-conquest New World, that was only snuffed out by what may have been foreign invasion. The Terminal Classic, from about 800 until 925, was therefore a time of tragedy and triumph, in which old thrones toppled in the south as a new political order took shape in the north, in which southern cities fell into the dust as northern ones flourished. It was an era marked by widespread movements of peoples, during which the destinies of central Mexico and the Maya area became as closely intertwined as they had been in the days of Teotihuacan's hegemony, and in which the stage was set for the rise of a new power in Mexico, the Toltecs. The Great Collapse. The collapse of the Maya civilization in the southern lowlands at the end of the late Classic is indisputable, being abundantly documented in the archaeological record. What is in the dispute is the why. Generations of scholars have tried to account for the Great Collapse, and explanations have included just about everything from epidemic diseases, invasion by foreigners from Mexico, social revolution championed by Eric Thompson, and still a plausible hypothesis, lowering of the water table, and even earthquakes and hurricanes. Unfortunately, the latest classic inscriptions throw little light on the problem, since their parsimonious texts never deal with such mundane matters as censuses or agricultural production figures. From 751 to about 790, long-standing alliances began to break down, interstate trade declined, and conflicts between neighboring city-states increased. The Battle of 792, commemorated by the Bonampak murals, illustrates the situation. From 790 to 830, the death rate of cities outstripped the birth rate, while after 830, construction stopped throughout the central area, with the exception of peripherally located sites like Lamanai. The Katun, ending the date 103000 or 8889, was celebrated by inscriptions at only 5 sites. The Katun ending 10400 or 8909 appears only on a monument at Tonina, and incised on a jade from a site in northern Quintana Roo. And the very last Maya jade from the Peten was carved on a stela at Itzimte and corresponds to January 15th, 910. One by one, the lights of classic urban civilization had winked out. We know from the downfall of past civilizations such as the Roman and Khmer empires that it is fruitless to look for simple causes. But most Maya archaeologists can now agree that 3 factors were paramount in the downfall: endemic internecine warfare, overpopulation and accompanying environmental collapse, and drought. All 3 probably played a part, but not necessarily all together in the same time and in the same place. Warfare seems to have become a real problem earlier than the other 2. Rulers and their entourages had conducted military campaigns against the rivals as far back as the Preclassic, but by the late 8th century in the Patesh Batun region, these activities intensified and began to destroy the prevailing social contract, going far beyond the mere taking of a few royal captives for sacrifice. The system of palisaded walls encountered by Arthur Demarest and his associates at sites like Dos Pilas and Aguateca is debatable between AD 760 and 830, by which time many of the palaces and temple superstructures had been reduced to rubble, and the inhabitants, probably augmented by refugee villagers from the rural hinterlands, lived a fearful existence in mere thatched huts huddled within the walls. As Demarest writes, there was a real de-evolution from cities involved in regional alliances, to warring centers, to minor sites, to tiny villages, all within half a century. Dramatic confirmation of the role of war in the Great Collapse has been uncovered at Yaxchilan on the Usumacinta River by Japanese archaeologist Akira Taneko. In the extreme west of the city, the ruined West Acropolis stands on a natural hill 165 feet high, the rubble covering its stairway, and inside its lowest building, a weak point in its defenses. Taneko found 217 projectile points. Almost all were of flint, and have been used on darts propelled by atlats, new testimony to a final battle before the city's death. Other cities in the central area eventually fell victim to the same cycle of violence. What had happened to classic Maya society? Demise lays it to an intensification of inter-elite competition, showing itself in different ways, and not only in wasteful architectural extravagance, in balkanization of political authority, and in senseless regional wars, but also in ecological overexploitation. This last factor has found recent confirmation in research undertaken by Kevin Johnson at the site of Itza, on the small tributary of Rio Pasion. Thanks to a long road bulldozed through a residential part of the site, Johnson has determined that about a half of all domestic house floors were not located on top of house mounds, and thus would have been invisible to the usual archaeological surface survey. What this means is that we may have to double our previous population estimates for the central area, which already run into the many millions. One can conclude that by the end of the 8th century, the classic Maya population of the southern lowlands had probably increased beyond the carrying capacity of the land, no matter what system of agriculture was in use. There is mounting evidence for massive deforestation and erosion throughout the central area, only alleviated in a few favorable zones by dry slope terracing. In short, overpopulation and environmental degradation had advanced to a degree only matched by what is happening in many of the poorest tropical countries today. The Maya apocalypse, for such it was, surely had ecological roots. The final factor in the Great Collapse may have been drought. In Chapter 1, we described the recent, highly convincing geochemical evidence that there had been a major episode of droughts in the Maya lowlands which lasted from AD 800 to 1050. Given the kinds of social, political, and ecological stresses already in effect in the central area, this might have been the final blow which finished off classic culture in the Peten once and for all. Year after year, the increasingly desperate peasantry may have planted their dwindling supply of seed corn, only to see it wither as soon as it sprouted from the parched earth. With the Maya ruling elites no longer able to call down the rains from Cha'ak, they would soon have lost the mandate of heaven. The revolutions hypothesized by Eric Thompson could have been the final act in the tragedy. The entire institution of kingship had lost its relevance to the everyday lives of the Maya people. It was not just the Stela cult, the inscribed glorification of royal lineages and their achievements, that disappeared with the collapse, but an entire world of esoteric knowledge, mythology, and ritual. Much of the elite cultural behavior to be described in Chapter 9, such as the complex mythology and iconography found on classic Maya pictorial ceramics, failed to reemerge with the advent of the post-classic era, and one can only conclude that the royalty and nobility, including these scribes who were the repository of so much sacred and scientific knowledge, had gone with the wind. They may well have been massacred by an enraged populace, and their screenfold books consumed in a holocaust similar to that carried out centuries later by Bishop Landa. New investigations have shown that at least some of the central area population survived the debacle, for instance, in the valley of the Belize and New Rivers, finally to succumb to diseases introduced by the Spanish invaders of the 16th and 17th centuries. Nonetheless, these dwindling groups would have known little about the glories of the classic past, and some would have been wanderers among the now empty centers, camping out like savages or archaeologists, in the rooms of forgotten palaces, people like the Lacandan, burning copal incense before the strange depictions of mortal men and women who had now become gods. But what happened to the bulk of the population who once occupied the central area, apparently in the millions? This is one of the greatest mysteries of Maya archaeology, since we have little or no evidence allowing us to come up with a solution. The early colonial chronicles in Yucatec Maya speak of a great descent and lesser descent, implying two mighty streams of refugees heading north from the abandoned cities into Yucatan, and Linda Shell and Peter Matthews, like Sylvanus Morley before them, believe that this account reflects historical fact. We shall return to this theory in the next chapter. Some may have migrated in a southerly direction, particularly into the Chiapas highlands. So far, however, this putative diaspora seems to have left no real traces in the archaeological record. Saibal and the Butun Maya. The great city of Saibal on the Rio Pasion apparently recovered from its defeat at the hands of the far smaller Dos Pilas, but during the Terminal Classic it seems to have come under the sway of warriors or warrior traders from further afield. The evidence is to be found in the part of the site known as Group A. In its south plaza sits an unusual four-sided structure with 4 stairways. In front of each stairway is a stela, and the 5th stands inside the temple. All 5 record the Gatun ending 10-1000 or December 1st, 8849, and have their protagonist as an individual with the name Watu. Two of them show him as an obvious foreigner with clipped mustache and page boy haircut, but wearing classic Maya regalia. There are even more foreign-looking stelae at Cibal, which belonged to this period, with non-Maya calendrical glyphs, and one wearing the bird mask of the central Mexican wind god, Echat, with a Mexican speech scroll curling from the beak. Who were these people? We have much to learn about the 9th century in the southern Maya lowlands, but could Eric Thompson have been right in thinking that the Peten or Chontal Maya of Tabasco and southern Campeche plains have been taken over some of the more important sites in the southern Peten, such as Cibal, perhaps moving into a power vacuum? These somewhat Mexicanized merchant warriors controlled the great Gulf Coast entrepot of Xicalanco, where Mexican and Maya traders met, and were known to the later Aztecs as Olmeca Xicalanca. There is now incontrovertible evidence that the Peten had not only penetrated into the lowland Maya heartland, they had reached the central highlands of Mexico. In recent years, excavations at the hilltop site of Cacaxtla, traditionally ascribed to the Olmeca Xicalanca, have uncovered a 9th century palace with brilliant polychrome murals in Maya style. Among other things, these show dignitaries in Maya costume bearing Maya ceremonial bars, which are in the style of the Peten-influenced stela of Cibal, in a great war going on between two contending factions, which immediately recalls the battle scene of Bonampak. More recently, Linda Shell and Peter Matthews have given a different interpretation of Huatul. According to them, the text on his monuments imply that he was not a foreigner from the west, but had been placed in Cibal by the ruler of Yucatan, a city of the eastern Peten. But that does not answer the question of the patently Mexican hieroglyphs on other Cibal monuments. And regardless of what these texts may tell us about who supposedly sent him from the east, the fine orange ceramics typical of this period at Cibal and other terminal classic sites in the Peten definitely originated in the west, on the Gulf Coast Plain in Peten country. One of the stela in question records that a ceremony involving Huatul was witnessed by a visitor from Puuc, or place of the reeds. While Shell and Matthews believe this to have been Chichen Itza, it is equally possible that this was Tolan or Tula, the Toltec capital in far-off central Mexico. This is a matter still in dispute. The question remains, if these were the Olmeca Xicalanca or Peten Maya, what were they doing there almost 500 miles from their homeland? For that matter, why are there bas-reliefs showing seated figures in Maya style on the 9th century temple of the feathered serpent at Xochicalco in Morelos, just south of the Valley of Mexico? It is now evident that the 9th century was a time of turmoil over much of Mesoamerica, with the power of Teotihuacan long since gone, and the old order in the Maya lowlands breaking down. In this power vacuum, the Peten, seasoned businessmen with strong contracts ranging from central Mexico to the Caribbean coast of Honduras, must have played a very aggressive role in a time of troubles, and their presence in the Mexican highlands may have played a formative role in what was to become the Toltec state. Puuc sites in the northern area. If Yucatan were to gain a name and reputation, wrote Bishop Landa in 1566, from the multitude, the grandeur, and the beauty of its buildings, as other regions of the Indies have obtained these by gold, silver, and riches, its glory would spread like that of Peru and New Spain. Landa was not exaggerating, for ruins there are by the hundreds. Sylvanus Morley saw this as evidence for what he called a new empire, founded by refugees from the derelict civilization of the central area, his so-called Old Empire. And he claimed to find references in the late Maya chronicles to a double-pronged migration from the south. However, ceramics recovered from excavations, along with a better reading of the ethno-historic sources, led Eric Thompson and George Brainerd to the view that many of the Yucatan sites were coeval with the Peten centers, which were claimed to predate them. Modern scholarship has found that both schools were partly right and partly wrong. The great era of the Yucatecan culture was the terminal classic, when many Peten cities had fallen into ruin, but there was never a real empire among the Maya, as Morley had believed. It will be remembered that a group of very low hills, the Puuc, is to be found in southwestern Yucatan, a region, as Nicholas Dunning and Jeff Kowalski tell us, that has deep and fertile soils, in fact the best in the northern part of the peninsula. Perhaps by the late Preclassic, the Maya of the region had learned how to construct tultunob, or bottle-shaped cisterns, to provide scarce drinking water over the dry season, and populations began to expand. During the late Classic itself, the Puuc was fragmented into many relatively small major centers, controlling domains that included pockets of particularly productive soil. It is in the Puuc that the dominant terminal classic style of the peninsula took form, by the end of the late Classic. The problem of dating is acute, for some of these centers are mentioned in the chronicles by late upstart lineages who claim to have founded them, but there are truncated long count dates painted on capstones in the late 9th and early 10th Baktun. The very latest reads 10-3-17-12-1, or 8905, but Thompson believes that the Puuc style may have lasted until 10-8-0-0-0, 89-87, when Toltec invaders usher in the post-Classic. Characteristic of the Puuc buildings are facings of very dense squares of limestone veneer over the cement and rubble core, boot-shaped vault stones, decorated cornices, round columns and doorways, engaged or half columns repeated in long rows, and the exuberant use of stone mosaics on upper facades, emphasizing the usual masks with long hook-shaped snouts, as well as frets and lattice-like designs of crisscross elements. In the perfection of architectural facades, the Puuc is far ahead of the more sloppy Peten style. Thanks to the research of Carl Taube, University of California, Riverside, and the University of Leiden's Eric Boot, it is now clear what these abundant architectural masks represent. Long mistakenly identified as faces of the Mayurban god Cha'ak, they are actually iconographic mountains, wits, the descendants of the corner masks placed on classic period monuments like Copan's temple too. On some Puuc buildings, and at Chichen Itza, they often have bands containing stylized flowers above the eyes. In effect, they transform each into Puuc and Chichen Itza building, where they are found into the flower mountain. In Taube's words, a solar celestial paradise, a shining place of flowers and beauty. This is a concept widely disseminated throughout Mesoamerica from at least Teotihuacan times, and even onto the Pueblo cultures of the American Southwest. Uxmal is by far the largest Puuc site, and one of the triumphs of the Maya civilization. Traditionally, this was the seat of the Shu family, but this was a Johnny-come-lately lineage of Mexican origin that could not possibly have built the site. The archaeological and epigraphic evidence testifies that Uxmal had emerged as the capital of a large terminal classic state centered in the eastern Puuc between AD 850 and 925. Uxmal is dominated by two mighty temple pyramids, the Great Pyramid and the House of the Magician. The upper temple of the latter entered through a monster mask doorway like those of the Chenes. Next to the Magician is the imaginatively named Nunnery, actually a palace group made up of 4 separate rectangular buildings arranged around an interior court. Although the group could be entered from the corners, the principal gateway with its corbel arch lies on the south side. The mosaic elements making up the masonry facades of the Nunnery quadrangle are particularly interesting. They include miniature representations of the thatched roof huts of the ordinary folk of the time. An iconographic study by Chef Kowalski suggests a cosmological layout for the nunnery. The higher placement of the north building, with its 13 exterior doorways reflecting the 13 layers of heaven, and the celestial serpent surmounting the huts, identify it with celestial spear. The iconography of the west building, with 7 exterior doorways, 7 is the mystic number of the earth's surface, and figures of Pawatun, the earth god as a turtle, indicate this to be the middle world, the place of the sun's descent into the underworld. The east building has mosaic elements reflecting the old war cult of Teotihuacan, where tradition had it that the sun was born. Thus, this may also be middle world, the place of the rising sun. Finally, the south building has 9 exterior doorways. The underworld, or Xibalba, had 9 layers, and has the lowest placement in the complex. It thus seems to be associated with death in the nether regions. Below the Great Pyramid, on its own artificial terrace, is the House of the Governor, the finest structure at Uxmal, and the culmination of the Puuc style. The upper facade or frieze of the 3 long interconnected structures of this building is covered by a fantastically elaborate mosaic of thousands of separate masonry elements set into the rubber core. A symphony of step and fret, lattice work, and flower mountain mask motifs combined into a single harmonious whole. There are only a handful of carved stelae at Uxmal. Not only are they sloppily executed, but they are in a sorry state of preservation. Nevertheless, Kowalski has been able to work out a partially dynastic history dominated by the figure of Lord Cha'ak, during whose reign the House of the Governor was built, probably as his administrative headquarters. A causeway or sacbe, 1¼ miles, or 18 kilometers long, runs southeast from Uxmal, or should I say 11¼ miles long, runs southeast from Uxmal to the small site of Nopa to Kaba, so presumably the 3 centers were connected ceremonially, if not politically. Caba is noted for its Puuc palace, with an extraordinary facade made up of hundreds of flower-mounted masks, and for its freestanding arch. Sayil, to the south of Caba, is dominated by a magnificent three-story palace. It has the additional distinction of being thus far the only Puuc site to be completely and intensively mapped. Jeremy Sabloff of the University of Pennsylvania, who headed the project, estimates that about 10,000 people lived in an urban core of 1.7 square miles, with an additional 7,000 in the zone around this core. To the east of Sayil is Labna, another sizable Puuc city, with an elaborate freestanding arch far more impressive than Caba's, a palace group, and a lofty temple pyramid. Etna is the southernmost of the Puuc sites and is best known for its five-storied structure which combines features of pyramids and palaces. Presumably in its late Preclassic canal and moat system, described in Chapter 2, remained in use throughout the Terminal Classic. The Terminal Classic at Chichen Itza. That the Puuc style reached east as well as north is evidenced at the great site of Chichen Itza in east central Yucatan, where a number of buildings at this otherwise Toltec Maya center closely resemble those to the west, with the proviso that Puuc veneer masonry is seldom present. These are largely located in the southern zone of the city and include the three-story nunnery, the Akab Tsib, dark writing, so called from the reliefs containing glyphic texts on one of the doorways, the Casa Colorada, the Temple of the Three Lintels, and the Temple of the Four Lintels. Lintels in the nunnery and other buildings contain quite extensive hieroglyphic texts. These were inscribed within a very brief period spanning only the second half of the 9th century, and celebrate not the dynastic history of individual kings, as in the southern lowlands, but rather temple dedication rituals such as bloodletting and drilling of new fire. Some scholars believe that Chichen Itza was then governed by what the later Maya chronicles called mutapal, or joint rule, seemingly by at least two groups of three, or perhaps four brothers, under whose auspices the rites were carried out. Nonetheless, more recent analysis by Eric Wood and David Stewart has shown that most of these supposed brothers are actual deities, rather than humans. A well-attested, non-divine individual often found in the text is named Kak Upakal, or Fiery Shield. The colonial sources mention a Kak Upakal, who is described as a valiant Itza captain, and this raises the question of whether these are the same persons. If so, then he might have been an Itza Maya, but we will defer the treatment of these enigmatic people until the next chapter. Could the rulers of the Terminal Classic Chichen have been Putun? This is also a possibility, since there are distinct iconographic links between the late monuments of Cibol and those of Chichen, even in the Toltec Maya period. Regardless of ethnic affiliation, there is no question that from about AD 870 to 890, Kakupakal was paramount in Chichen, since in the text he is given the title of Kuhuaha, or Holy King. One of the strangest and most intriguing structures ever raised by the Maya is the caracol, Spanish for snail, located in the Puuc section of Chichen. Once stigmatized by Eric Thompson as a two-decker wedding cake on the square card in which it came, it is nevertheless one of the outstanding monuments of the Terminal Classic. The caracol has long been described in the popular literature as an observatory, and this has been proved beyond a shadow of a doubt by measurements taken by the archaeoastronomers Anthony Aveni, Sharon Gibbs, and Horst Hartung. The ancient Maya used lines of sight taken from its platforms and door window jambs to plot the rising and setting positions of the sun, the moon, and above all, the planet Venus. As will be seen in Chapter 9, Maya astronomers had a remarkably accurate knowledge of the apparent motion of Venus, and it may be that at least some of that learning came from observations carried out in the caracol. Ek Balam. Located some 32 miles northeast of Chichen Itza, the site of Ek Balam is a compact but impressive center dominated by a large acropolis. That conditions in this remote part of the Maya lowlands were then dangerously unsettled is testified by the triple defensive wall that surrounds the site. Excavations at Ek Balam began in the 1980s under William Ringel and George Bay, and have continued under the direction of the Mexican archaeologists Leticia Vargas de la Peña and Victor Castillo Borges. These spectacular finds have thrown altogether unexpected light on the Terminal Classic culture in the northern Maya lowlands, especially the discovering of the abundant hieroglyphic texts painted on the walls and capstones of Ek Balam's buildings. According to these, and to a slightly garbled tradition recorded in early colonial times, the history of Ek Balam, like certain other Maya cities, began with the arrival of a founder from some other place. In this case, it was an individual called Ek Balam, Star Jaguar or Black Jaguar, who arrived on April 7th, AD 770, and for whom the place was anciently named. It is possible that he came to the north from the central area. According to Spanish epigrapher Alfonso La Cadena, the first real king in these records was Uquitcan Lectoc, father of 4 hard flints, who took the throne in the following month. Uquitcan Lectoc is specifically named as Cuhulacha, holy king of the kingdom, which bears the name Talol. This man, probably more powerful in his day than even the rulers of Chichen Itza, had a very long reign, perhaps more than 4 decades, and seems to have been responsible for most of what can be seen at the site today. The principal monument raised by Uquitcan Lectoc and his successors is the Acropolis, 525 feet long and 102 feet high, a very complex structure with many superimposed building stages, and with a quantity of corbel vaulted rooms on various levels, connected by an intricate system of stairways and passages. An extraordinary and perfectly preserved frieze in white stucco forms the facing of the upper levels. This probably gave the building its ancient name, Sakshokna'a, White House of Counting, or White House of Obedience, Respect. During the tenure of Uquitcan Lectoc, entrance was through the stuccoed bifang maw of a gigantic flower-mounted mask in pure Chinese style. Magnificent life stucco humans are arranged around the mask, one fetchingly seated within the mask's left eye. A number of Acropolis rooms have capstones painted with figures of a seated Kawi'il, a god of royal descent, or a bird-like Itzamna'ach deity, see Chapter 9, along with a text giving the date on which the capstone was placed and the owner of the room or building, usually Uquitcan Lectoc, king of Talol. About 8814, in the most important of these rooms, the corpse of the great king himself was laid out on a jaguar pelt, and the room sealed as a tomb. With him was the richest offering ever found in the northern area, including animal and human sacrificial victims, and a gold frog, possibly an import from Panama, and one of the earliest attested metal objects yet discovered for the Maya. Next to his head was a stuccoed ceramic vessel with an incised text, part of which reads, "The chocolate vase of Uquitcanlec, the warrior cutter of hearts, the handsome one, prince of the earth, holy king of Talol." Significantly, on the room's capstone, the ruler is portrayed not as Kawi'il, but as the youthful maize god, perhaps a conscious evocation of Pakal, the great sarcophagus lid in faraway Palenque, a representation celebrating resurrection and apotheosis. Ek Balam's heyday lasted until September 896, the date of its final inscription, but its fate was finally sealed by the arrival of the Toltec army on the Maya scene, and the dominance of the entire Yucatan Peninsula by a new Maya Toltec warrior caste based at Chichen Itza. The Coatzamalguapa problem. The Pipil have always been an enigmatic people. Their language is Nahuatl, a close relative of Nahuatl, the official tongue of the Aztecs, differing mainly from the latter by a substitution of T in place of TL. Having intruded into the Maya area at some unknown time from an equally unknown region in Mexico by the Spanish conquest, the Pipil had established a major settlement in a small zone within the well-watered Piedmont zone just above the Pacific plain of Guatemala. From traditions recorded in colonial times, however, it is known that their domain had once extended somewhat to the west into lands later claimed by the Chichen Maya. This once peopled territory is the locus of a vanished civilization which was indisputably Mexican, centering upon the town of Santa Lucia, Coatzamalguapa, in a region which once was famed for its production of cacao, the chocolate beans used not only for drink but as currency. According to Dr. Osvaldo Chinchilla, there are only 3 Coatzamalguapan sites known: El Castillo, Bibao, and Santa Maria Coatzamalguapa, or perhaps just one, large one, for all lie within a tiny area of only 20 square miles. Each is a compact ceremonial center consisting of temple substructures arranged on a single large platform measuring only a few hundred yards on its long axis. Structures have earthen cores faced with river cobbles, but stairways and some courts were occasionally covered with dressed stone. Connecting them is a network of causeways. The stone sculpture of this culture is more widely disseminated, being found even in the Antigua Basin, in the highlands to the west of Guatemala City. While it may have begun in the late Classic, from the evidence of art style and pottery, the Guatemala culture must have flourished in the terminal Classic. A more hard, cruel, and unsympathetic sculptural style can hardly be imagined, or one less Maya in its general aspect. As Eric Thompson noted, the Guatemala sculpture showed a haunting preoccupation with death. Reliefs of skulls and mannequin figures of skeletons are not uncommon. Their second obsession was the rubber ball game. Secure evidence for the game comes from certain stone objects that are frequent in the Guatemala zone, and in fact over much of the Pacific coast down to El Salvador. Of these, most typical are the U-shaped stone yokes, which represent the heavy protective belts of wood and leather worn by the contestants, and thin heads or hachas with human faces, grotesque carnivores, macaws and turkeys, generally thought to be markers for the zones of the court, but worn on the yoke during post-game ceremonies. Both are sure signs of a close affiliation to the classic cultures of the Mexican Gulf Coast, where such ballgame paraphernalia undoubtedly originated. Among the relief and in-the-round sculptures of the Guatemala sites are the representations of some purely Mexican gods. Xipetotec, the wind god Ehecat, shown as a horrifically snouted monster with one extruded eyeball. Tlaloc, Tlauchitonatiu, god of the rising sun, the old fire god, Huehueteot, and Quetzalcoatl as feathered serpent. On some magnificent stela, ballplayers wearing yokes and protective gloves reached up to the celestial deities, usually the sun or moon. From the bodies of gods and men may sprout the fronds and pods of cacao, the apparent source of Guatemala wealth. Not only their religion, but their very calendar was Mexican. The majority of the glyphs and the monuments are recognizable as the kind of day names prevalent among the peoples of southern Mexico, while the numbers and coefficients are expressed in the Mexican fashion by dots or circles only, without the use of the bar for 5 so characteristic of the Maya. Again, as in Mexico, individuals and perhaps gods too were identified by their day of birth. The creators of the Guatemala civilization, then, were not Mayan but Mexican, most likely the people themselves. There are suggestive connections with the Gulf Coast Plain, where there is a similar concentration upon the ballgame, death, human sacrifice, and the cultivation of cacao. If these were the pipil, then there might have been an ancient center of Nahuatl speakers in southern Veracruz who, as another Posteca group, could have invaded the southern Maya area across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. But the Guatemala problem is very far from solved. The end of an era. Beyond the continuing mystery which surrounds the demise of civilization in the Peten and neighboring regions, there is still much to be learned about the Terminal Classic. In many respects, what transpired in the Puuc area was a replay of the great collapse which had taken place a century earlier in the southern lowlands. For reasons which are yet unclear, but which may also include overpopulation and a growing inability of the Puuc rulers to feed their people, all of its cities and lesser centers were virtually abandoned by the end of the 10th century. When first encountered by the Spaniards, they were in ruins. There was one great exception to this second collapse. To the east of the Puuc, Chichen Itza was to gather a new strength, and to become the largest and perhaps even the most powerful Mesoamerican city of its day, as the transition was made from classic to post-classic. This concludes Chapter 6.